Joseph of Arimathea. Yards away, we have a wine press, which must have been used for the garden's fruit. It was there before Jesus' burial and is one of the largest ever found in Israel. The cistern and the winepress are circumstantial evidence, but the most telling piece of evidence is just outside the tomb. St. Matthew tells us that after Jesus' body was prepared for burial and the disciples had sent their farewells, the tomb was closed by rolling a huge circular stone across the entrance and sealing it in place. The heavy stone and seal were fitted on the orders of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor.
Sir,
they said,
we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, "After 3 days I will rise again." So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he's been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first.
Take a guard. Go make the tomb as secure as you know how.
Both the Jewish establishment and the Roman authorities were afraid of Jesus and what he represented. After all, only a few days ago, he had overturned the moneylenders' tables in the temple and told they were mocking God. He was threatening both the Jewish establishment and the Roman occupiers. When Jesus was arrested, Pilate asked him to claim that he was the King of the Jews, to commit treason. Jesus didn't deny it. He turned it back on Pilate. Is that your own idea? No wonder the Romans were jittery. The chief priest and the Pharisees already knew the prophecy that the Messiah would rise again and were desperate to make sure that when Jesus was dead and buried, he would stay that way. Looking at this model, we can see how the tomb was sealed. Here's the entrance, and outside it, the great stone with its guide track for rolling it into place. Once the stone was rolled along the guide track, completely covering the entrance, it stopped. We can see the ledge that stopped it to the right. Our group measured the outside of the tomb and tried to estimate how big the stone would have been. This is the shape, and we estimated it would have had a diameter of 12 feet and weigh 9 tons. To prevent anyone rolling the stone back, an iron spike may have been driven into the rock face. It would now be quite impossible to open the tomb. It was sealed as far as Pilate and the chief priest was concerned, for all eternity. But St. Luke tells us that when Mary Magdalene and the other women went to the tomb on the 3rd day, they found the stone rolled to one side. St. Matthew tells us there was an angel in the tomb and that the panic-stricken guards had fled. Realizing that Jesus' body was no longer in the tomb and terrified what Pilate would do if he found out, the chief priest's men bribed the guards to say nothing.
You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.
So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day.
To the left hand of the entrance, there is evidence that a metal spike was driven into the rock at a height of 71 inches. There was probably another spike on the other side, but that's since disappeared. Critics claim that this is not evidence of a metal spike at all, but remnants of shrapnel from battles of the last century. However, tests have shown the metal is ancient. Whilst later critics doubt its authenticity, there is plenty of evidence that early Christians believed this the right place. The walls inside the tomb have red crosses etched and painted into them, together with the Greek symbols for Alpha and Omega, which Jesus, with the phrase, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last," was used as a metaphor for himself. Very often, we find that holy sites named in the Bible have been holy for generations, and that the same places were associated with prophets that later figure in the New Testament. We decided to investigate the links between the Temple and Garden Tomb to events in the Old Testament. The Temple Mount itself, when we look at a topographic view, forms a yod, which is the 10th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, the first letter in God's name in Hebrew. When written down, it forms the shape of a hand, as is clear from the picture. In Deuteronomy, Jehovah tells the Israelites to make sacrifices where I shall place my name. In Old Testament times, this whole area was known as Mount Moriah, made famous by the story of Abraham and Isaac. In the New Testament, the key site becomes the Temple on the Mount, because it was here that Jesus preached his most famous sermon, confronting the religious leaders of the day for their hypocrisy. The Temple on the Mount is 741 meters above sea level, but it is not the highest point. The top of the mountain, Golgotha, stands 777 meters high. 777, 3 sevens, in biblical terms, the perfect number, the beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega. So was God foretelling the sacrifice of his own Son, the Alpha and Omega, through the testing of Abraham? Near the part of the site that looks like the base of the skull, the team found what many scholars believe to be Jeremiah's grotto, or prison. Jeremiah is famous in the Old Testament and in medieval paintings for his lamentations on the first fall of Jerusalem, which occurred in 587 BC. The team could find no evidence of this grotto, apart from this ancient map, which clearly bears the legend Jeremiah's Gate. We asked Manuel Dominguez and Alex Newton to translate this ancient map, which was in French.
Does it look like Jeremiah Grotto?
Let me see. Grotte de Jérémie. Yes, that's it. It's Jeremiah's grotto.
I think it is. Are you sure? Yeah, it's Jeremiah Grotto.
Grotte de Jérémie.
Right,
That's right. Very interesting. That is very accurate.
Even in
The site of Jeremiah's grotto is directly opposite and is now a banana warehouse. The present owner was most hospitable, kindly showing us around. By now, the team had found so much evidence that their heads were reeling. Unfortunately, it was also time to go home, and from this point onwards, most of our inquiries would become library and internet-based, but no less exciting for that. One of the advantages of the internet is being able to call up documents and maps at the click of a mouse, but Simon spent many hours on the computer before he managed to find what he was looking for. The question was, what other evidence is out there to prove whether or not the tomb in the garden is the real thing? The topography of the landscape forms crucial evidence. At the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, It was impossible to imagine what it must have looked like in Jesus' time. At the tomb in the garden, this is somewhat easier. It's a garden. The image of a garden recurs in several paintings of the scene. Some of these ancient maps place the crucifixion in the same landscape. Might it be that some of these depictions are based on knowledge which is now lost to us? The team visited the Jewish National and University Library in Israel to confirm the date of these ancient maps. Dated 1584, 300 years before the Garden Tomb was discovered.
This map shows us an imaginary depiction of a biblical Jerusalem. We can see here, for example, Jesus and the course he made through the city until the place of the crucifixion. The original map was printed in Köln in 1584 by Christian van Aderkam. Considered a very important depiction of Jerusalem. Published at the beginning of the 17th century, it is drawn after a map dated 1584.
Take a look at this map from the 16th century. We can see the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus is being arrested, and the old gate through which he will carry his cross to Golgotha.
Well, this is a fascinating map. Obviously, it's the first time I've ever seen it. The salient points that are important is way up at the top is the Mount of Olives. And when the New Testament speaks of a garden, it speaks of either a citrus grove or an olive grove, and that's an olive grove. And the Mount of Olives will bring right down through to Gethsemane. And we know that the Lord was in Gethsemane prior to his final trial, and then he would have been led out of the city. Today's Damascus Gate is very ornate, but underneath Damascus Gate we do find there the remains of an Herodian gate, and that area has been associated with gates. Saul of Tarsus would have left from there. The great sacrifice got to be on the side of the north according to Levitical law, and this picture down here that they've drawn in of the crucifixion site does appear to be on the side of the north, and it is outside the gate, and the writer to the Hebrews makes that abundantly clear. And Roman law said crucifixion had to be outside city precincts. So I find this fascinating, and it could well be that this is something that of great interest, frankly, that I've never seen before.
If we now turn the picture like this to match up with a modern map of Jerusalem, we can see how closely the main features agree. The site of the crucifixion lines up with the place of the skull, and the location of Jesus' tomb lines up precisely with the tomb in the garden. One of the maps shows the tomb of Saint Stephen, who was the first disciple to be martyred. This tomb is just yards away from the garden, and the team went in search of it, finding a church dedicated to Saint Stephen on the exact spot. This raises another series of questions. How did the printmaker know of these locations? Both these sites were covered in rubble and not fully excavated until the 19th century. The city boundaries have changed and the walls have been rebuilt. But if we remove this section, we find Golgotha, both on a corner and outside the city walls, exactly where it should be according to the Gospels. An earlier map, drawn before Christ, shows the position of the early walls with great accuracy and puts the gate of Ephraim in the same position as later editions.